How do you reconcile being loving and caring in a world where there's such evil possibility? How do you make sense of it? What kind of world is this? Is this a safe world? How should we be? Is there anything we can do about it?
Hi, I'm Dr. Yudah Pryce. I'm a clinical social worker, and today we'll be talking about spirituality and mental health.
I'm Dr. Kenneth Pargament. I'm a professor emeritus at Bowling Green State University and clinical psychologist with a specialty in the psychology of religion. I do both research and practice.
So, doctor, tell me about yourself. How did you grow up? What led you to become the person you are today?
I grew up in a very caring Jewish community in Washington, D.C., and we were a close neighborhood. Kids could go out and play without their parents monitoring them because we all knew that the neighbors also looked out for each other. So it was a very caring place. But I also, even at a young age, had a sense of darker undercurrents. Sometimes I'd hear people whispering, and they weren't whispering because they were telling the punchline to Yiddish jokes that they didn't want us all to hear, the kids. It seemed to be something more serious. And I remember I mustn't have been more than 6 or 7 hearing a story about my next-door neighbor who had, his father had left Russia after his father had been hung in a pogrom, and his father had witnessed it under the steps. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is really kind of frightening. And it was a time, the 1950s, when most of the neighbors had experienced something of World War II, either through the military or through the Holocaust. I remember asking my parents about a woman who lived across the street who rarely came out of her house, but she had ink on her wrist. And I asked them about that, and they said, that's a tattoo. She was in a concentration camp. I didn't know what that meant, so I Early on, I read Diary of Anne Frank, and I was so shocked by the reality that could have happened, that so many in our community and Jewish community worldwide could have been murdered. And I couldn't reconcile, how do you reconcile that with being part of a loving, caring family and community with the possibility that the world can turn against you? I remember my father told me this story. I must have been about 9 or 10. We were shopping together in a mall in Washington, D.C. And some man came up to my father and asked us, are you Jewish? Just out of the blue. And he tells me that I took a step in front of my father, and he said, I asked him, why? Do you want to persecute us? And it amazes me that I must have been that actively thinking about safety. So I think early on I had questions, big questions. How do you reconcile being loving and caring in a world where there's such evil possibility? How do you make sense of it? What kind of world is this? Is this a safe world? How should we be? Is there anything we can do about it? And all of those questions, I think, attracted me ultimately to the field of psychology, because the psychology deals with those questions, at least I thought psychologists did, and I ended up going to graduate school in clinical psychology. But I was at least somewhat disappointed. I only semi-jokingly say that my first client was a 5-pound pigeon, because I worked with the pigeon to learn about principles of reward and reinforcement. It was a course in operant conditioning. Behaviorism was in its heyday with B.F. Skinner. And I learned something about that in the world, but my pigeon didn't have a lot to say about the big questions. Why are we here? How do we make the world a better place? What's the meaning of it all? So I found myself drawn gradually to religious writings. I just felt like I was hearing voices in these writings that were grappling with similar questions as me. And so I started to go out and interview people from different religious communities. And in particular, I was interested not in the theological questions, but in how do people draw on their faith in difficult times, for better or worse. And I found that their responses were very emotionally powerful. People had strong reactions to the question. And I also was struck by the fact that no one was neutral to it. Whether or not religion was good or whether it was a force that had really shaken them up, there was emotional power, and that struck me that this is something we need to be looking at more. So I started to do some studies, and I got hooked by the research bug, and I started doing more research and took an academic job, and I haven't stopped since.
For some of us who are less imaginative, spirituality can seem a little bit vague, the term at least. How do you see spirituality relating to psychology?
Well, maybe I could start with a definition. But what do we mean by spirituality? Because that's you get 10 people in a room and you'll get 12 different definitions. But I think of spirituality as what people do to develop a relationship with whatever they may hold sacred in their lives. I believe we are all spiritual beings, not just psychological, social, or physical beings, but spiritual beings. And we have a propensity, we're yearning for something beyond ourselves, what I call the sacred. Now, the sacred is a very broad concept. The sacred includes not only our ideas of divinity, but also other aspects of life that can take on sacred status because they become associated with the divine. And in Judaism, that's a big part of Judaism, is to sanctify all aspects of life: marriage, parenting, work, the environment. It goes on. The arts. All of life can be seen as sacred. So spirituality is what we do to foster and nurture and grow that relationship with the sacred dimension of our lives. And we find that it makes a big difference in people's lives. What do they see as sacred? How do they form that relationship? How do they try to sustain it? What happens when that relationship is shaken? All of this is part of the development of spirituality over the lifespan.
So can you tell me how your Jewish background contributed to your quest for truth?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think for many years my own Jewishness was more an implicit part of who I was than an explicit part. Last 10, 15 years, it's become more explicit so I can actually talk about how it's shaped me and my work. I think one important understanding I have is that I firmly believe that we each are given a divine spark. And part of what we need to do when we're helping people who are having problems, many of them have lost touch with that sacred spark, and we need to try to help them locate it and kind of blow on it and fan that flame. So that's a very Jewish idea. Another aspect of being Jewish for me that has been implicit, but that I understand better now, more explicitly, is just my love of questions. When I was a child, I just was always asking questions. And looking back on it, I realized I was never shut down for that. I was never criticized. No one said, "You're asking too many questions. Be quiet already. Shut." No, I think my family, enjoyed talking about these issues and asking questions. And most of my teachers in school did too. And so questioning became for me a way of life. And being able to appreciate mystery and what we don't understand, and being confused at times and facing paradox, that for me is just part of who I am, but it's part of being Jewish too. You may have heard this joke, but I love this joke. It's a story about a rabbi and his wife traveling in Israel. And along the way, they're stopped by two men who sought him out because they're having a disagreement. So the rabbi says, "Okay, I'll listen to both of your sides." So the first man explains his position, and the rabbi says, "You're right." The second man then describes his side of the story, and the rabbi says, "You are also right." And the wife of the rabbi says, "You're saying they're both right, but they're saying different things. How can they both be right?" And the rabbi says, "You're right." So it's that's life. That's what we face. Paradox, that two different things can be true. And how do you live with paradox and conflict at times and confusion? That's part of our job in being human. And I think Judaism has a real appreciation for that.
So can you tell me, why do you believe that therapists should become spiritually competent as well? Don't we have enough clinical tools at our disposal already?
We certainly have a lot of clinical tools. As I'm sure you know, we have books and books and books of them. But oddly enough, something's been missing, and that has been the spiritual dimension. And we know that spirituality adds a distinctive dimension to being human. The research has shown, for instance, that spirituality can be a really vital resource for people. For instance, a number of studies have shown that people who attend religious services regularly, once a week or more, live 7 years longer on average. On the other hand, some forms of religious expression are more problematic. And so we know that people who struggle spiritually, people who have serious questions and doubts, that can lead to declines in physical health and mental health. And these are all interwoven in the problems people encounter in their lives, including their mental health issues. And unfortunately, mental health professionals as a group receive very little training on how to identify and integrate spirituality into treatment. Most graduate students across the mental health professionals have not had a course in religion or spirituality. So when those issues come up, and they do come up in therapy, they're often left really ill-prepared to address those kinds of problems. And we've been very interested in developing educational programs to foster spiritual competencies among mental health professionals. And we found that we can do that fairly effectively and efficiently as well across the mental health fields.
So could you tell me the clinical benefit of turning to spirituality during tough times?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've spent lots of years studying it. We've been really, my graduate students and I and colleagues, we've been very interested in trying to identify the kind of spiritual ingredients that are distinctively helpful to people. So we've measured what we call spiritual coping methods. And these are things like turning to the divine for support in difficult times, turning to your congregation for support, being involved in religious rituals, redefining or reframing a critical time in life from a larger benevolent spiritual perspective. So the pain and the suffering, as real as it is, doesn't have the full word or the last word on our lives, and so on. These are what we call spiritual coping methods, and we find that they add value to other coping methods. They add above and beyond those coping methods to our mental health and our resilience to major life problems that we can encounter. I think when I take a step back from it and think about, well, what is it that spirituality is adding that is distinctive, I think that our fields of healthcare, psychology, medicine, and our culture more generally, is very mastery-oriented, control-oriented. This is in the United States, we try to solve problems. We try to lengthen life. We do all we can to deal with problems and get them resolved and out of the way. But the reality is that we remain frail and finite people, and that no matter how well we take care of ourselves with exercise and good eating and all of the best health practices, the reality is we're still frail, we're still finite, and sooner or later, all of us face the end. So how do we come to terms with the limits of our control? How do we come to terms with the fact that many problems are not amenable to mastery and control. How do we accept that? And I think that the religion and spirituality are, I think, in some ways designed to help people come to terms with their humanness, their frailty, their finitude, the fact that we will all die. That's what we have in religion and spirituality. And in that way, they add a distinct dimension to our other skills that we need. Yeah, sure, we need to master and we need to try to solve problems as best we can, but that's not the full story. And I think in that sense, spirituality, it completes us, helps to make us whole.
Can you tell us a little bit about spiritually competent psychotherapy and how you are training therapists according to this model?
Yeah, we've been working to train therapists to become more effective in integrating spirituality into mental health care, specific competencies that we believe all therapists should have. First of all, therapists should be sensitive to and appreciative of the fact that we are spiritual beings. And that means being open to conversation about our religious and spiritual lives. That opens the door to further conversation, as opposed to ignoring it or deciding that it's not important. So first of all, just being aware of, attentive to, and willing to talk about those issues. The second competency is recognizing how people's spiritual resources may be of value to them in difficult times. When people face problems, depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, they often become disrupted, deregulated, we call it. And they lose touch with the problem-solving skills or competencies that they've had. So if you're really depressed, you may stop eating, you may isolate yourself and not talk to people, you may stop exercising, you may pretty much shut down. Well, one of the things a good therapist will do is encourage them to get back into their rhythm. Well, the same's true around spiritual resources. In difficult times, people may stop going to their congregation. They may stop praying if that's been a regular part of their lives. They may stop drawing on their faith as a source of support and strength. And so helping clients re-access or get back into their religious and spiritual rhythm can be very valuable. That's a competency. The third one is helping people when they face religious or spiritual problems or struggles. In difficult times, for some people, their view of the world spiritually or religiously can add to their distress. They may feel like they're being punished by God. They may feel like they've been abandoned by their congregation. They may feel that they've lost all meaning in their lives. Well, those are, I'd call them psycho-spiritual issues. They're both psychological and spiritual. And I don't think we can afford to ignore them if we're going to help people in a holistic sense. Then it's important to identify one's own, as a therapist or counselor, one's own religious and spiritual preconceptions and biases. The reality is many therapists, as I said, are not particularly religious themselves. Some have an anti-religious bias. And so just as in other areas of our lives where we need to do some soul searching and figure out, well, what do we bring to the relationship? Therapists need to see what they're bringing to their relationship when religious and spiritual issues arise. And that's to avoid any kind of potential bias on a therapist's part or shut down the conversation. So those are just a few of the competencies that we've been helping people address through our training program.
Going through graduate school, I went through a top-notch social work school. We didn't talk about spirituality. Just don't be biased, a general thing, but not how to incorporate it. And when you said it, like it's connected to people, whether they find meaning in life and purpose and direction, how they may deal with anxiety, and that we're at the core of spiritual beings. It makes sense that every therapist should be or should know about spiritually competent psychotherapy.
Well, you're right. Fortunately, that's changing now.
As an Orthodox Jew, I want to know, are there any tips that people can do to increase spirituality in their lives so that it leads to improved outcomes and well-being?
Another great question. And we're actually doing a lot of work there now of how we can identify spiritual practices that do foster flourishing and health and well-being. I think that if you think of spirituality as a potential that we're all born with, then people who are born and raised in religious communities, that potential is constantly being cultivated and nourished. It's part of the air you breathe. It's just part of who you are and who you become. But not everyone is raised in that type of a community. And so the challenge then is to, in a more personal quest, discover and find those sacred practices that can foster your own sense of the sacred in life. In our own work, I'll give you just one example, we've been very interested in what we call sacred moments. These are very special moments in which we experience a sense of transcendence. Moments when we feel that we're in touch with something that's real, when we cut below the superficial and get in touch with what's really real. Moments when we feel that the experience is boundless in time and space. These are the moments where we feel these powerful spiritual emotions of awe and wonder and love and compassion and deep gratitude. And the moments can be transformational too, that in a brief period of time, because of that sacred moment, it transforms our lives. So we've been studying these moments a lot in the last few years and find that, in fact, these sacred moments do lead to really important positive mental health changes for people. And it's not earth-shaking in the sense of we're asking people to do something amazing. We're just asking people to attend to sacred moments in their lives in the present or in the past. We have an exercise where we ask people to try to recall a sacred moment. We call it the treasure chest reflection. And the treasure chest they're asked to reflect on contains like gold coins, sacred moments. They can pull one out and reflect on it, and they transform your life. These are the moments where you remember something that your mother said to you, when you saw the Grand Canyon, when you listened to a piece of music and you felt like you were in touch with something that was really divine in nature. These are the moments that make life worth living. And so facilitating these sacred moments is a way of facilitating your wellness overall, your wholeness as a person.
So are there any particular age groups or life stages where people are more spiritually inclined?
I think so. We've just completed and published a book on spiritual struggles, Julie Exlin and I, my colleague. And what we've found through our research is that there are 2 times in life that spiritual struggles may be especially powerful and significant for people. And these are struggles that people may be having with God, with other people around religious matters, or within oneself, moral struggles, for instance. But we find spiritual struggles are probably most common among adolescents. And it makes some sense. Adolescence is a time when you're coming into your own, you're beginning to develop your own unique identity, and you're moving away from your family and finding greater independence. And that's true spiritually as well. But many adolescents will struggle around religious and spiritual issues. And we think it's then especially important that adolescents have a place to go where they can talk, where they can find some support, where they can learn that spiritual struggles are actually a normal part of life. I think, for instance, it'd be great if we talked more about spiritual struggles at the dinner table with family, particularly if you have adolescents. And they should be talked about on the Bima. I think if our clergy opened up the conversation to spiritual struggles and maybe shared some of their own struggles and how they came to terms with them, that would normalize them and I think encourage adolescents to stay in the fold rather than disengage, which many do as a result of spiritual struggles. We know spiritual struggles lead adolescents oftentimes to disengage from religious life. The other time that's really important, I think, around struggles is later life. When older people start to ask questions about, what was my life all about? Can I celebrate my achievements? How do I come to terms with the things I wanted to achieve but now I see I'll never achieve them. Do I move into despair, or do I find integrity in my life, as psychiatrist Erik Erikson talked about? So it's a really pivotal time. And again, creating a space where people can talk about these struggles towards the latter part of life, within the family, within the religious community. I think we need to be doing more of that to normalize struggles as a part of life and to share in that as a community.
Well, thank you, Doctor, for showing up and being willing to be interviewed and sharing with us such gems of wisdom that I think, right, if we could, it could change the profession fundamentally, right, if we incorporate spirituality. Me personally, I think Judaism, affects how I deal with all aspects of my life. So why not bring it into sort of the clinical space and help transform other people's lives?
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.